Pokemon games are pretty well known for their cut content, but some of it is a bit on the stranger side. Today, we're going to be looking at obscure cut content from every current Pokemon generation, aside from Gen 9 because those games aren't out yet. Let's get into it. Starting in Gen 1 is something that I recently mentioned in a previous video, but I wanted to bring back up here since unfortunately that video didn't do very well. And this way, hopefully some people will see this that didn't before, because it's really cool. Amongst a recent source code leak of Pokemon Red and Blue was a set of very early sprites for the game, and amongst these sprites was this guy. Now, he may not look very familiar at all, but he does actually appear in the final games, because according to cut content website The Cutting Room Floor, this man is identified in the leak as none other than Professor Oak, meaning that this was a very early iteration of the character, one that does not resemble the final version at all. However, there is a likely explanation for this. Since it is known that Pokemon took some early inspiration from games such as Final Fantasy, it's not a stretch to surmise that Pokemon possibly had more of a fantasy-like approach early on, which is the likely explanation for this more sagely version of Professor Oak. When it came to the development on the Gen 2 games, Gold and Silver, a ton of stuff that was originally planned was cut, as I have covered extensively on the channel, but one thing I haven't touched on is exceptionally obscure and dark. Mount Silver, one of the most iconic locations in the game, was always planned to be present, as early as the 1997 Space World demo for Gold and Silver, which we have seen in recent leaks. However, the area at the base of the mountain was different prior to the game's release, as it originally featured a maze-like forest. This forest was most likely based on Aokigahara, a forest that sits at the base of Mount Silver's inspiration, Mount Fuji. What makes this an obscure and dark inclusion, however, is that Aokigahara Forest is known by the nickname Suicide Forest, due to being one of the most significantly used locations for suicide in the world. Adding insult to injury is the fact that in the final game, Mount Silver is the only location where Mischievous, a ghost type, can be found in the wild, making for a particularly harsh and morbid reference to the real-life location. This forest was most likely removed from the games due to the perceived insensitivity that would have surrounded its inclusion. But with the combination of the forest and the appearance of a ghost type here, it's rather strange that it was even considered at all. Transitioning to Hoenn, our featured bit of cut content here is much more on the lighter side of things. Just like Pokemon Gold and Silver, the Hoenn games have also been the subject of source code leaks, and one of them revealed the dex entries of several Pokemon that were cut from the games. One of these in particular sounds especially quirky, as its dex entry categorizes it as the Shrub Pokemon, who was Grass-Water type, and apparently was also inspired by a sprinkler, as its dex entries say, quote, "It collects a large amount of water inside its body and sprays it out like a shower while rotating. It is convenient to have around on hot summer days. And it drinks over 100 liters of water a day. When the water it is collected in its body gets low, the leaves on both its hands wither." Unfortunately, no image of this Pokemon's design was found in the leak, but its description paints a rather unique picture of what it could have looked like. Furthermore, while this next part is just speculation, it's possible that this Pokemon would have been found at the Pretty Petal Flower Shop, given that the two are identical thematically, and it gives the flower shop one more reason to legitimately exist in the game, if it were indeed created to sort of showcase this Sprinkler Pokemon originally. It possibly could have even been tied to the mechanic of watering berries, which was a fairly significant part of the game, and maybe even replaced the Whelmerpel as an item as well. It's quite possible that this Pokemon could have had some significant plans prepared for it, and overall, its entire concept and potential integrations into the game with the Flower Shop is pretty unique. Meanwhile, the Sinnoh region might have a lot less water routes than Hoenn, but it certainly does not have any fewer source code leaks, as these games' source code was also leaked a couple years ago, and may I say, bless these leaks, it's so cool that we have access to this stuff. Anyways, from this leak came the reveal of a much larger gender variant system that was planned for the games compared to what we got in the final, which was the marquee reveal of this leak that you've probably heard about before. However, some smaller yet just as interesting bits of information were overshadowed in the process and weren't really spoken about, such as these early beta sprites for Finneon, Shinx, and Wormadam. Finneon and Shinx show minor but significant differences to their final designs, and Wormadam features a different coloration altogether. And for the sake of being thorough, while it has been covered more extensively, this is also what Lumineon looked like at this stage as well, being much more different to its final design than Finneon is. However, what really gives Sinnoh's cut content the label of obscure here has to do with another well-covered part of this leak, but something that really no one has noticed about it. The beta design for Arceus from this leak garnered a bunch of attention for not only being a beta design of Arceus, but also for its very unusual appearance. Its appearance is what we're interested in today because while it doesn't look anything like Arceus' final design, as the cutting room floor note on their website, it does bear a marked similarity to Marshadow of all things, with its body color, shadowy appearance, and most distinctively, its wide oval-shaped eyes. Based on visual similarities, it's very possible that this beta design of Arceus was recycled into Marshadow, but if that's the case, why? Other than both being mythical Pokemon, these two have nothing in common and no real connections to one another. So what would have inspired this apparent connection? Was it just the looks they were after, or was it something else? Hopefully, we'll get the chance to learn someday. For Gen 5, I have one that is unique amongst this list because it is entirely unconfirmed, but I believe there is way too much going on here for it all to be just one big coincidence. So, way back during the early days of my channel, I was doing research for a video when I came across a supposed leak for Pokemon Black and White, from around the time frame when those games had yet to come out. The leak was supposedly coming from someone who had a good track record in the past, and it stated two very interesting things. Number one, that there was going to be 157 new Pokemon in the games, and two, that the Trio Master of Reshiram and Zekrom was a large green Cobra Pokemon. Well, 157 is only one more than the actual number we got of 156, and a large green Cobra Pokemon sounds very familiar because that perfectly describes Zygarde, a Trio Master in its own right who would be released just one generation later in Gen 6. Now, already, those are some pretty good connections considering this was a Gen 5 era leak, but this next part, which I didn't mention in my super old videos, is where it really gets crazy. While Xerneas and Yveltal represent life and death respectively, Zygarde represents balance, a trait that would fit in perfectly with Reshiram and Zekrom's whole yin and yang theme. Also fitting it in well with those two is the fact that Zygarde is Dragon type, just like Reshiram and Zekrom. And here's the real kicker, its secondary type is Ground, which is super effective to both Reshiram's Fire type and Zekrom's Electric type, which makes perfect sense not only as a trio master of these two, but also would truly allow it to restore balance in their fight of truth versus ideals. I don't know about you guys, but you couldn't make that fit together any better if you had actually wrote it that way intentionally. And that sure fits way better than Qrem does thematically, or that even Zygarde does with Xerneas and Yveltal. Although, admittedly, there isn't really anything wrong with those Pokemon or their pairings either. Ultimately, as it is unconfirmed whether there is any truth to this, I will let you all be the judge, but as I said earlier, there is way too many perfect connections going on here for this to be entirely a coincidence as far as I'm concerned. Speaking of Zygarde though, it obviously did not get the kind of treatment that it was supposed to, or that it deserved, because even when it did debut in Gen 6, it didn't end up getting that elusive Pokémon Z title that it could call its own. Many suspected that this hypothetical game was planned but cancelled, and our suspicions were eventually proven true when yet another leak of internal information revealed that additional Kalos games were planned after X and Y, effectively confirming Pokémon Z as a real thing. However, what's strange about this is that in this list where the games are documented, there are two versions of this third Kalos game, instead of just the presumed one. What could this have meant for what was intended for them? Prior to X and Y, the only time we ever had a dual release for an enhanced version was for Black and White 2, the generation before, which were sequels. So, were these games going to follow in the footsteps of their direct predecessor and be sequels also? Meanwhile, the only time this happened afterwards was with Ultra Sun and Moon in Gen 7, and while they weren't sequels, they had drastically different stories compared to the original Sun and Moon. So, was the story of these Kalos games possibly going to be drastically altered to fit the Zygarde narrative? It's hard to say, but one thing is for certain. With 2 follow-up Kalos games planned instead of just 1, we were all robbed even harder than we thought we were. And that, my friends, is a travesty the likes of which I hope we never have to see again. If there is one bit of solace we can take away from all of this, however, but also not really, is that in the following generation, in Sun and Moon, they did attempt to give us some of the bigger parts of the obviously planned Pokémon Z, such as with Complete Zygarde. One piece of this puzzle that did not show up, however, was the Eternal Flower Floette, who exists within the data of X and Y as an event Pokemon of some kind, but that ultimately never came to fruition. However, it seems like maybe it was planned to resurface in Gen 7, just like Complete Zygarde, as the Eternal Flower Floette received Pokédex entries in these games, which it did not have in any of the games previously. What makes this strange is that exact fact, that this Floette was obviously originally planned for X and Y, and then later obviously Z, but its Dex entries don't appear in those games. They instead appear in Ultra Sun and Moon, a game that is known for having cut content from X and Y forcibly shoved into it, but even then, this did not end up being made available. So, what is the deal with this Pokemon? Why do its Pokédex entries only exist within a game that it wasn't even really intended for, and why were they included only for the Pokemon to not be made available? What was it about the Eternal Flower Floette that made Game Freak not want to release it on repeated occasions? It truly is one of the most mind-boggling mysteries Pokemon has ever seen, and I wish I had the answer for it. Finally, we come to Generation 8, and as it is, for the time being, the most recent generation of games to release, the known cut content is fewer and far between. But there is something here that does fall on the more obscure side of things. Within the unused content that exists within the data of Pokemon Sword and Shield is an item known as a wishing chip. While being its own individual item, functionally it serves the same purpose as the wishing pieces that do appear in the games, as its description reads, "Toss a number of them into a Pokemon den for the chance to attract a wild Dynamax Pokemon." It does seem strange that this item has the same effect as one used in the final game, but is its own separate item at the same time. However, I do believe I actually have an answer for why this is. The description for the wishing chip states to toss a number of them into a Pokemon den, while the description of the wishing piece simply says to throw one. This likely means that the wishing chip, which is also aptly named for this purpose, was a more diminutive version of the wishing piece, similar to the relationship between a potion and a super potion, for instance, and possibly it was cut from the games due to redundancy. Well, there you have it. Are there any bits of content here that you would have liked to have seen in the final games? Be sure to let me know in the comments below, and I will see you guys again very soon with another video. Until then, as always, thanks so much for watching this one, I appreciate it a ton, and I will smell you guys later.